Imagine a world where crowns were worth more than armies, where a single marriage could unite kingdoms, and where betrayal at a family dinner could change the fate of an entire continent. Europe's royal families weren't just rulers, they were the architects of war, wealth, and wonder. But just as they rose to unimaginable heights of power, they also faced scandals, betrayals, and brutal downfalls. Some were worshipped like gods, others hated like tyrants. And yet their legacies still shape our lives today.
No.
So buckle up, because the story of Europe's most powerful royal families is not just history. It's a saga of ambition, greed, love, and destruction. The birth of royal power in Europe. To understand the rise and fall of Europe's most powerful royal families, we must go back to the beginning, when kings and queens first began to rule, not just with swords, but with symbols of divine authority. Long before the castles, crowns, and jewels we imagine today, the earliest European rulers had to convince their people that they were chosen by God Himself. This belief gave them the power to control armies, collect taxes, and shape the destiny of their kingdoms. One of the first examples of this royal power was the Carolingian dynasty in the early Middle Ages. Their most famous king, Charlemagne, often called Charles the Great, became the ruler of most of Western Europe in the 8th and 9th centuries. Imagine it. At a time when small villages and tribes were scattered across the land, Charlemagne managed to bring them together under one crown. His empire stretched across modern France, Germany, Italy, and more. He was so influential that in the year 800 AD, the Pope crowned him as the Holy Roman Emperor, making him not only a political leader, but also a spiritual one. This moment set the stage for centuries of kings and queens claiming that their authority came directly from God, a concept called the divine right of kings. But royal power wasn't just about religion, it was also about land. The feudal system gave kings and queens enormous control, because land was the most valuable resource of the time. Nobles and knights pledged loyalty to their monarch in exchange for pieces of land, while peasants worked the soil to feed everyone. The king stood at the very top of this pyramid. If you imagine Europe as a giant game of chess, the monarch was the king, peaceful, powerful, and always protected. Still, power was never safe. For every royal family that rose, there were rivals ready to challenge them. Wars broke out, not only between kingdoms, but even within families. Brothers fought against brothers, cousins betrayed each other, and daughters were married off like chess pieces to secure peace, or sometimes to spark new wars. For example, Charlemagne's empire, after his death, was divided among his grandsons.
Nice.
Instead of creating unity, it led to bitter rivalries and a fractured empire. This showed one of the biggest weaknesses of royal families. While they rose to power through unity, they often fell because of their own greed and family disputes. Religion, land, and family ties formed the foundation of royal power. But there was one more element: myth and spectacle. Kings and queens made sure that their people saw them as more than human. Ceremonies, crowns filled with jewels, golden thrones, and massive coronations all reminded ordinary people that their monarch was different, untouchable, and even sacred. This illusion of divine and magical power kept people loyal, even when life under royal rule was difficult. In the end, the birth of royal power in Europe was not just about ruling people, it was about shaping belief. By mixing religion, land ownership, and family alliances, Europe's earliest royal families built dynasties that would last for centuries. But as we will see, what goes up must come down, and the same elements that gave them strength would one day cause their downfall. The rise of the Habsburgs? If there was ever a royal family that understood the game of power, it was the Habsburgs. Their story is almost like a movie filled with clever marriages, endless battles, and an empire so large that people said, "The sun never sets on the Habsburg lands." Unlike many families who fought for power through constant wars, the Habsburgs often used something far smarter: marriage alliances. The Habsburgs began as a small noble family in what is now Switzerland during the Middle Ages. At first, they weren't very powerful, but they had ambition. Slowly, through careful planning, they gained influence in the Holy Roman Empire. By the 1400s, they had already made their mark. The real turning point came when they realized they could expand their empire not just with swords, but with wedding rings. Their famous family motto was "Let others wage war, "You happy Austria, Mary?" And believe it or not, it worked. Through smart marriages, the Habsburgs gained control of huge parts of Europe. They married into the royal families of Spain, Hungary, Bohemia, and even the Low Countries, today's Belgium and Netherlands. This meant that instead of conquering these lands through bloody wars, they gained them peacefully by marrying their sons and daughters into the right families. By the time Maximilian I and his grandson Charles V came to power, the Habsburgs ruled over an empire so vast that it stretched across Europe and even into the newly discovered lands of the Americas. Charles V, crowned in the 16th century, became one of the most powerful rulers in European history. He was not just the King of Spain, but also the Holy Roman Emperor, which gave him control over most of Central Europe. His empire included Spain, Austria, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and massive territories in the New World. Imagine ruling so much land that it would take months just to travel from one end of your empire to the other. That was the reality of the Habsburgs. But this kind of power came with huge challenges. Governing so many different cultures, languages, and religions was almost impossible. Charles V spent much of his life fighting wars on multiple fronts against France, against the Ottoman Empire, and even against the Protestant Reformation, which was spreading across his territories. His empire was strong, but it was also stretched too thin. Another challenge came from inside the family. The Habsburgs were so focused on marrying within their own circle to keep power in the bloodline that it caused problems. Over generations, this led to inbreeding, where close relatives married each other. This weakened the family physically and mentally. One of the most famous examples is Charles II of Spain, who was so sickly and deformed due to inbreeding that he could barely rule. His death without an heir eventually led to the War of the Spanish Succession, which weakened the Habsburg dynasty. Still, during their height, the Habsburgs shaped Europe in ways no other family did. They proved that power was, and always won on the battlefield. It could also be won at the marriage altar. Their empire left behind incredible art, culture, and architecture, but also wars and struggles that tore Europe apart for centuries. The rise of the Habsburgs is a lesson in ambition and strategy. From a small family in Switzerland, they climbed to the very top of Europe by being smarter than their rivals. But as we'll see in later sections, the bigger the empire, the harder it is to control, and even the mighty Habsburgs could not hold their power forever. The glory and scandals of the Bourbons. If the Habsburgs were masters of marriage politics, then the Bourbons were masters of show and power. Rising out of France in the late Middle Ages, the Bourbon family would go on to become one of the most famous and controversial royal dynasties in European history. Their story is filled with glory, luxury, and also shocking scandals that eventually led to their downfall. The Bourbons first came to real power with Henry IV of France in the late 1500s. France had been torn apart by religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. But Henry managed to bring peace with a clever move. He converted to Catholicism, even though he had been born a Protestant. He famously said, "Paris is worth a mass," meaning that ruling the French capital was more important than sticking to one religion. This act made him king and started the long Bourbon dynasty in France. The peak of Bourbon power came under Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King. His reign lasted for over 70 years, making him one of the longest ruling monarchs in European history. Louis XIV turned France into the most powerful country in Europe. He built the Palace of Versailles, a breathtaking symbol of wealth and control. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a political tool. By bringing nobles to live there, he kept them under his watch, dazzling them with luxury, while making sure they didn't plot against him. But Louis XIV's glory came at a price. His constant wars drained France's treasury, and the common people suffered under heavy taxes.
Ow.
While the royals danced in gold-filled halls, peasants starved in the countryside. This growing gap between rich and poor planted seeds of anger that would explode a century later. After Louis XIV, the Bourbon line continued with kings like Louis XV and Louis XVI. Louis XV was charming, but irresponsible. He was famous for his many mistresses and his careless spending. Instead of solving France's problems, he added to them. His grandson, Louis XVI, would inherit the crown at the worst possible time. By the late 1700s, France was drowning in debt. The people were hungry, and revolutionary ideas about freedom and equality were spreading fast. Louis XVI and his famous Queen Marie Antoinette became symbols of royal arrogance. Marie was rumored to have said, "Let them eat cake," when told the people had no bread, though historians believe she never actually said it. Still, the image of her living in luxury while the people starved made her deeply unpopular. In 1789, the anger finally exploded into the French Revolution. Crowds stormed the Bastille prison, and soon the monarchy itself was on trial. In 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine, followed by Marie Antoinette. The once glorious Bourbon dynasty had fallen in the most dramatic way possible, through revolution. And yet the Bourbons didn't completely disappear. They returned to power after Napoleon's defeat in 1815, though never with the same strength. Their rule was shaky, marked by more scandals and eventually more revolts. The story of the Bourbons shows how a family can rise to incredible heights of glory, building palaces and ruling with absolute power, only to fall because they ignored the suffering of their people. They remind us that power without responsibility always leads to downfall. The Tudors, power, love, and betrayal. Few royal families capture people's imagination like the Tudors of England. Their dynasty may not have lasted as long as the Habsburgs or the Bourbons, but it was filled with drama, romance, betrayal, and shocking twists that still fascinate people today. In fact, many of the Tudors' choices shaped the England we know today. The Tudor story began in 1485 with Henry VII, who claimed the throne after defeating King Richard III at the famous Battle of Bosworth Field. This victory ended the Bloody Wars of the Roses, a series of civil wars between two rival families, the Lancasters and the Yorks. Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York united the two families, creating a new dynasty, the Tudors. His rule brought stability to a country that had been torn apart by years of conflict. But the most famous Tudor wasn't Henry VII, it was his son Henry VIII. Henry VIII is remembered as one of England's most powerful and controversial kings. He wasn't just a ruler, he was larger than life, strong, ambitious, and proud. Henry wanted two things above all: power and a son to carry on his dynasty. The problem was, his wives couldn't give him the male heir he desired. And this led to one of the most dramatic events in European history, the English Reformation. Henry VIII was originally married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess. When she failed to give him a son, he asked the Pope for an annulment, but the Pope refused. Furious, Henry broke away from the Catholic Church and created the Church of England, making himself its head. This decision didn't just change religion in England, it changed politics, culture, and history forever. Henry went on to marry 6 times, and his love life became almost as famous as his politics. His wives' fates are remembered in a grim rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Behind these marriages was not just love or lusted, was the desperate need for a male heir. Ironically, it was his daughter, not a son, who would become England's greatest monarch. After Henry's death, his son Edward VI briefly ruled but died young. Then came his daughter Mary I, also called Bloody Mary, who tried to restore Catholicism by burning Protestants at the stake. Her short and bloody reign made her deeply unpopular. Finally, the throne passed to Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter with Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth I became one of the most famous queens in history. Known as the Virgin Queen, because she never married, she ruled for 45 years. Under her reign, England experienced a golden age. The arts flourished with writers like William Shakespeare. Explorers like Sir Francis Drake brought back treasures. And the defeat of the mighty Spanish Armada in 1588 made England a global power. Elizabeth proved that a woman could rule with intelligence, strength, and charisma. Yet with Elizabeth's death in 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended. She left no heir, and the throne passed to the Stuarts of Scotland. The Tudors had risen in blood, ruled with passion, and left behind a lasting legacy. They changed religion, inspired culture, and created one of the most famous dynasties in history, all in just over a century. The Tudor story is a reminder that power often comes with personal sacrifice. Their dynasty rose on marriage alliances and wars, but it ended because they could not secure a lasting bloodline. Still, their legend lives on in books, movies, and the imagination of people around the world. The Romanovs' tragedy of Russia's last Tsars. If there was ever a royal family whose story feels more like a tragic novel than history, it is the Romanovs of Russia. They ruled for more than 300 years, turning Russia from a small, struggling state into a vast empire that stretched across Europe and Asia. But in the end, their fall was as shocking as their rise, ending in violence and mystery. The Romanov dynasty began in 1613 with Michael I, chosen as Tsar after a period of chaos known as the Time of Troubles. From that moment, the Romanovs worked to build a powerful and unified Russia. Over generations, they expanded their empire through wars, exploration, and reforms. Russia grew so large that it became the biggest country in the world, and the Romanovs were at the very center of it all. One of the most famous Romanov rulers was Peter the Great. He ruled in the late 1600s and early 1700s and is remembered for dragging Russia into the modern age. Before Peter, Russia was seen as backward compared to Europe. Peter traveled secretly across Europe, studying shipbuilding, science, and even fashion. When he returned, he forced Russia to adopt European styles, building a navy, modernizing the army, and even ordering nobles to shave their beards. He also built St. Petersburg, a new capital city that looked like a European city and became known as the Window. To the west, after Peter came another iconic ruler, Catherine the Great. She wasn't even Russian by births. She was a German princess who married into the Romanov family. When her husband Peter III proved weak and unpopular, Catherine seized power. Reign in the 18th century became known as the Golden Age of Russia. She expanded the empire, supported the arts, and made Russia a major European power. Under her, Russia was feared, respected, and admired. But as the Romanovs gained more power and wealth, they also grew more distant from ordinary Russians. Now the royal family lived in grand palaces like the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Peasants struggled in poverty. Over time, this gap between the rich and poor became dangerous. By the 19th century, revolutionary ideas about freedom, equality, and socialism were spreading across Europe. Pan-Russia was no exception. The final chapter of the Romanovs came with Nicholas II, the last Tsar. He ruled during the early 20th century, a time when Russia was facing wars, poverty, and protests. Nicholas was seen as weak and out of touch. His wife, Alexandra, placed great trust in a mysterious monk named Rasputin, claimed to heal their sick son Alexei. Rasputin's strange influence over the royal family shocked the nation and made people lose even more faith in the Tsar. During World War I, things got worse. Millions of Russians were killed, food shortages spread, and anger boiled over. In 1917, the Russian Revolution exploded. Nicholas II was forced to give up the throne, and the Romanovs were arrested. In 1918, the unthinkable happened. The Tsar, his wife, and their 5 children were executed by revolutionaries. The dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 3 centuries ended in blood and tragedy. The Romanov story is both inspiring and heartbreaking. They built an empire that shaped world history, but they failed to understand the struggles of their people. Their fall showed what happens when rulers ignore the voices of the nation. Even today, the Romanovs remain a symbol of both royal glory and the fragility of power. The Hohenzollerns, Prussia's military kings. While some royal families ruled with luxury and others through marriage politics, the Hohenzollerns built their power with discipline, order, and above all, the military. They were the rulers of Prussia, a small German state that grew into one of the strongest military powers in Europe. For the Hohenzollerns, war was not just a duty, it was their way of life. The Hohenzollern story began in the 15th century when they first gained control of Brandenburg, a region in what is now Germany. At first, their lands were poor and divided. But the family believed that with enough discipline and strong armies, they could turn weakness into strength. Over generations, they built a system where the military wasn't just part of the state, the military was the state. One of the most important early rulers was Frederick William, who ruled in the 1600s, and is remembered for transforming Prussia into a strong and organized state. He created a professional army, established strict laws, and encouraged trade. Under him, Prussia became respected, even feared by its neighbors. But the true glory of the Hohenzollerns came in the 1700s with Frederick II, better known as Frederick the Great. He was one of the most brilliant military leaders in European history. With a relatively small army, Frederick managed to defeat much larger powers like Austria and France. His victories in the 7 Years' War proved that Prussia was no longer a minor state. It was now a European great power. Frederick the Great wasn't just a soldier. He was also a lover of art, music, and philosophy. He invited great thinkers like Voltaire to his court, built beautiful palaces like Sanssouci, and modernized Prussia's government. But no matter how much he loved the arts, his real passion was the army, he once said. Diplomacy without weapons is like an orchestra without instruments. For Frederick, everything revolved around military strength. The Hohenzollerns continued to build on this legacy in the 19th century. Under King Wilhelm I and his famous Prime Minister, Otto von Bismarck, Prussia led the movement to unify Germany. Through clever diplomacy and 3 successful wars, Bismarck created the German Empire in 1871. With Wilhelm I crowned as the first German emperor, this was the peak of Hohenzollern power. From ruling a poor and divided land, they now controlled a united, industrial, and powerful Germany. But with great power came great problems. The later Hohenzollerns, especially Kaiser Wilhelm II, pushed Germany into dangerous territory. Wilhelm II was ambitious and aggressive, determined to make Germany a global power. His militarism and rivalry with other European nations helped spark World War I. The war was a disaster for Germany, and in 1918, after the country's defeat, Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate and flee into exile. With him, the Hohenzollern dynasty lost the German throne forever. The rise and fall of the Hohenzollerns showed the power and the danger of building a dynasty on military strength alone. Discipline in war made them great, but they also made enemies everywhere. Once Germany lost the war, the dynasty had no foundation left to stand on. Today, the Hohenzollern legacy is still debated. Some admire their discipline and achievements, while others see them as symbols of militarism and aggression. But one thing is certain: they transformed Prussia from a poor backwater into one of the strongest nations in Europe. The Medici, bankers who became kings. Not every royal family started out with crowns and castles. Some, like the Medici family of Florence, rose to power through money. They were not kings in the beginning, they were bankers. But with their wealth, ambition, and clever strategies, the Medici built one of the most influential dynasties in European history. Their story shows how money can be just as powerful as armies. The Medici family began in the 14th century as merchants and bankers in Florence, Italy. Florence at that time was not a kingdom, but a wealthy city-state. Banking was extremely important because trade across Europe was growing, and kings, nobles, and even popes needed loans. The Medici Bank became one of the most powerful financial institutions in Europe. With money flowing in from across the continent, the family quickly rose to the top of Florence's society. But the Medici didn't just use their money for themselves. They understood that power required influence, and influence could be bought. They became famous for sponsoring artists, architects, and scholars. This support for the arts helped spark the Renaissance, a cultural movement that transformed Europe. Without the Medici, the Renaissance as we know it might never have happened. They funded artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Botticelli. Imagine being so powerful that the world's greatest geniuses worked for you. That was the power of the Medici family. At the same time, the Medici also moved into politics. They used their money to control Florence's government, often behind the scenes. The most famous Medici leader was Cosimo de' Medici, who became the unofficial ruler of Florence in the 15th century. He was not called a king, but his influence was so strong that he might as well have been one. Later, his grandson Lorenzo de' Medici, also known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, became one of the most powerful figures of the Renaissance. He was admired for his charm, intelligence, and his endless support of art and culture. The Medici influence didn't stop at Florence. Through careful planning, the family married into European nobility and even placed their members in the Catholic Church. To Medici women, Catherine de' Medici and Marie de' Medici became queens of France. Several family members became popes, including Pope Leo X, who used Medici wealth to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. This shows just how far their influence reached. from bankers in Florence to shaping the politics of all Europe. But like many dynasties, the Medici power also faced decline. Their bank eventually collapsed due to poor management, and rival families in Florence plotted against them. The family survived several exiles, assassinations, and revolts. Although they returned to power multiple times, by the 18th century their line had weakened.
And my last Medici ruler of Tuscany, Gian Gaston de' Medici, died in 1737 without an heir, ending the family's direct rule.
Still, the Medici legacy remains unmatched. They may not have worn crowns like the Tudors or ruled vast empires like the Habsburgs, but their impact on culture, art, and politics shaped Europe for centuries. Their story proves that money and influence can sometimes create more lasting power than armies and wars. The rise and fall of the Medici remind us that dynasties are not always born from swords. Sometimes they are built in banks and workshops, fueled by gold and ideas. The Stuarts. Civil War and Revolution, the story of the Stuart dynasty in Britain, is one of power, conflict, and dramatic change. While some royal families grew stronger with time, the Stuarts faced constant battles with their own people. Their reign saw civil war, revolution, and even the execution of a king, something that shocked the world. The Stuart family first came to the English throne in 1603, when James VI of Scotland became James I of England. This happened after the death of Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, who left no heir. With James's rule, England and Scotland were united under one crown for the first time. First, it seemed like a new golden age. James I was educated, interested in art and literature, and even sponsored the famous King James Bible, one of the most important works in English history. But James also believed strongly in the divine right of kings, the idea that kings were chosen by God and should not be challenged. This belief brought him into conflict with Parliament, which represented the people and wanted more power. These tensions only grew worse under his son, Charles I. Charles I was proud, stubborn, and unwilling to compromise. He wanted absolute control, while Parliament wanted a say in how the country was run, especially about taxes and religion. Charles married a Catholic princess, which made many Protestants suspicious. He also tried to force religious changes that angered the people. Eventually, the conflict boiled over into the English Civil War in 1642. The war was between the royalist supporters of the king and the parliamentarian supporters of Parliament, often called Roundheads. At first, Charles seemed confident, but the parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell, built a disciplined army and defeated him. In 1649, something unimaginable happened. Charles I was put on trial and executed for treason. For the first time, a European king was killed by his own people in a court of law. The monarchy was abolished, and England became a republic under Cromwell. But the Stuarts were not finished yet. After Cromwell's death, the monarchy was restored in 1660 with Charles II, the son of the executed king. Known as the Merry Monarch, Charles II was loved for his charm and love of entertainment. But his reign was also marked by disasters like the Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666. Still, he managed to keep the crown and avoid his father's mistakes. After Charles II came his brother, James II. James was openly Catholic, which frightened many in Protestant England. People feared he would bring back Catholic rule, so in 1688, he was overthrown in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. Instead of bloodshed, James fled, and Parliament invited William of Orange and his wife Mary II, James's daughter, to rule jointly. This event marked a turning point. From then on, Parliament had more power than the monarchy, creating the constitutional monarchy that still exists in Britain today. The Stuarts' story is full of drama and change. They rose with hope, clashed with Parliament, and saw their dynasty nearly destroyed by civil war and revolution. But out of their struggles came a new system of government that limited royal power and gave more rights to the people. The fall of the Stuarts reminds us that even kings and queens cannot ignore the will of the people forever. Power built only on pride and divine claims cannot last. Their dynasty may have ended, but their struggles shaped modern democracy. The Bonapartes. From revolution to empire, when most people think of royal dynasties, they imagine families with centuries of tradition and long bloodlines. But the Bonapartes of France were different. They rose from the chaos of revolution, and their most famous member, Napoleon Bonaparte, built an empire that shook all of Europe. The Bonapartes showed that sometimes power could come not from ancient crowns, but from ambition, brilliance, and sheer will. Napoleon was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, which had recently become part of France. His family was minor nobility, but they were not rich or powerful. From a young age, Napoleon showed incredible intelligence and ambition. He trained as an officer and quickly rose through the military ranks during the French Revolution, a time when old monarchies were being destroyed and France was in political chaos. By the late 1790s, Napoleon had made a name for himself as a brilliant general. He led French armies to victory against Austria and other European powers. The people loved him because he was seen as a hero who defended the revolution, even though he secretly dreamed of becoming much more. In 1799, Napoleon staged a coup and took control of France. Just 5 years later, in 1804, he crowned himself emperor of the French, a bold move that shocked Europe. Unlike the Bourbons, who claimed their power came from God, Napoleon claimed his power from the people and his own success. As Emperor, Napoleon built one of the largest empires Europe had ever seen. He reformed laws, creating the Napoleonic Code, which still influences legal systems today. He reorganized education, modernized the economy, and spread revolutionary ideas of equality and merit. But his greatest strength was still the military. He fought and defeated powerful coalitions of European monarchies again and again. Victories like the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805 made him seem unbeatable. At his peak, Napoleon controlled most of continental Europe, placing his brothers and relatives on thrones in Spain, Italy, and beyond. But just like many before him, Napoleon's ambition was his downfall. He launched a disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, where his army faced brutal winter conditions and starvation. Most of his soldiers died, and his enemies seized the chance to strike back. In 1814, Napoleon was forced to give up the throne and was exiled to the island of Elba. Incredibly, he escaped the next year and returned to France, raising an army once again. This short period, known as the 100 Days, ended at the famous Battle of Waterloo in 1815, where he was finally defeated by British and Prussian forces. After that, Napoleon was exiled again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean, where he died in 1821. Even after Napoleon's death, the Bonaparte name did not disappear. His nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, became Napoleon III and ruled as Emperor of France from 1852 to 1870. However, he too faced defeat, losing the Franco-Prussian War, which ended the Bonaparte dynasty for good. The Bonapartes rose faster than almost any dynasty in history, but their fall was just as dramatic. They proved that one man's genius and ambition could change the world, but also that even the greatest leaders cannot fight against the limits of power forever. Napoleon's story remains legendary because he was not born a king, he made himself one. And in doing so, he created a dynasty that, though short-lived, left a permanent mark on Europe. The Windsors' survival in the modern age, while many royal families of Europe fell to wars, revolutions, or scandals, one family has managed to survive into the modern era, the Windsors of Britain. Their story is not about building empires or winning great battles, but about adapting to change. The Windsors show how a royal family can hold on to power even when the world around them changes completely. The family we now call the Windsors actually began as the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a German dynasty. When Queen Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg in the 1800s, their children carried his name. For a while, this German connection wasn't a problem. But when World War I broke out in 1914, Britain was fighting against Germany. And suddenly, having a German-sounding royal family was very unpopular. In 1917, King George V made a bold move. He changed the family name to Windsor, after Windsor Castle, one of the most famous royal residences in England. This simple change was a clever act of survival. The Windsors have faced many challenges since then. One of the biggest came in 1936, when King Edward VIII shocked the nation by abdicating or giving up the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. His decision was seen as scandalous because the king was supposed to put duty before personal love. Edward's younger brother became King George VI, who struggled with a speech impediment, but won the people's respect by leading Britain through World War II with courage and determination. After George VI's death in 1952, his daughter Elizabeth II became queen. Her reign lasted more than 70 years, making her the longest-reigning monarch in British history. Elizabeth became a symbol of stability and duty in a world that was changing rapidly. Under her, the British Empire transformed into the Commonwealth of Nations, a group of independent countries that still recognized historic ties to Britain. She steered the monarchy through social change, political challenges, and global crises. But the Windsors have also faced scandals and struggles. The most famous was the troubled marriage of Prince Charles and Princess Diana. Their divorce and Diana's tragic death in 1997 shook the monarchy. Many people criticized the royal family for appearing cold and out of touch with the public's grief. Yet over time, the Windsors adapted, becoming more open and modern in their image. Today, under King Charles III, the Windsors continue to face questions about their future. Some argue that monarchies are outdated and should end, while others see the Windsors as an important symbol of tradition and national identity. Despite all the challenges, they remain one of the most recognized and talked about royal families in the world. The Windsors' survival is not based on absolute power like the Tudors or on military might like the Hohenzollerns. Instead, it is based on adaptability. They gave up real political control long ago, allowing Parliament to rule the country. Instead, they became symbols representatives of history, unity, and continuity. In a way, their survival proves that sometimes the best way for royalty to endure is not by fighting change, but by embracing it. The story of the Windsors is the perfect ending to the tale of Europe's royal families. From the divine authority of medieval kings to the glittering courts of the Renaissance, and from bloody revolutions to modern democracy, Europe's royal dynasties rose and fell in dramatic ways. The Windsors stand as the last great dynasty still standing. Proof that survival in the modern world requires not just power, but wisdom and flexibility. And now, I want to hear from you. Which royal dynasty do you think had the most fascinating story? The glory of the Tudors, the tragedy of the Romanovs, or the ambition of the Bonapartes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading every single one. If you enjoyed this journey through history's most powerful families, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next epic story. And remember, crowns may fade, empires may fall, but history never dies.